and welcome to this discussion on the new Irish border question. Fintan O'Toole proposed the death of the old Irish nationalism and the birth of a new, more pluralist concept of multiple citizenship based on shared space rather than bounded territory. And I think since the Good Friday Agreement, many in Britain and in Ireland had hoped that the old quarrels, the old border question, had been consigned to history, along with Ireland's historic claim to sovereignty and self-determination in a 32-county republic. But this gentle drift towards a brave new post-nationalist future appears to have stalled as cooperation between Britain and Ireland has broken down and the border has once more loomed back into view as a point of contention. And as the Brexit negotiations move towards their end point, alarm about the prospect of a hard customs border, either dividing the Northern Ireland from the south or around the island of Ireland, separating Northern Ireland from Britain, seems to have summoned up many of the old ghosts that I think many of us believed had been laid to rest on Good Friday in 1998. So this is a very timely discussion. We're not going to focus too much on the detail of the Brexit negotiations, but I really want us to dig deeper below the political controversies and the social and cultural and historical currents that are fueling them. So that's the idea. We have four speakers who are going to be in conversation initially. After about 20 minutes, we're going to come out to the audience and ask for your questions, comments and contributions to this discussion. So let me just introduce them and we'll get started. To my right is Ray Bassett, Dr. Ray Bassett, who is a senior fellow in EU affairs for the Policy Exchange. He's a former Irish ambassador with a distinguished record in the Irish Diplomatic Service and the Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade. And he's also a regular columnist on the Sunday Business Post. And next to him, on the far right there, is Dr. Kevin Bean, who is a lecturer at the Institute of Irish Studies and the University of Liverpool, and he's written widely and researched widely on Irish politics and the politics of the peace process. And then to my left here is Denis Russell. And Denis Russell is a building contractor based in London. He's worked in Britain and Ireland. He's a former history teacher as well and worked in further education and brings an extensive knowledge of Irish cultural and political history based on his teaching and writing and commentary. And then far left there, Justin Smyth, who is a librarian based in Dublin, and sits on the advisory board of the newly founded journal Studies in Arts and Humanities. He's also the co-founder of the Dublin Salon, which is a forum for public debate dedicated to free speech and unfettered inquiry. And I think that's something that all of our speakers have in common, that they are not afraid to challenge received wisdom and consensus. So I'm looking forward to that in the discussion that follows. I'm going to start off really with a question. I'm going to ask Ray, because he's written a lot about this, really relating to the current situation between Ireland, Britain and the EU in the negotiations that are going on, that are really making the headlines now. And whether this is a sort of orientation towards, Ireland seems to be orientating towards the EU and away from Britain. That seems to be the direction of travel. Could you talk about that just a little bit and tell us really a little bit more about what's happening?
Yeah, sure, Pauline. I'd say the London-Dublin relationship is probably the worst it has been maybe for 30 years, 30, 40 years, which is not a satisfactory position for Ireland to be in. I think the problem basically is Ireland never really got Brexit and never believed Brexit was going to happen, and it took a long, long time to come to terms with Brexit. We had our policy essentially has been to support the European Union, 100%. I believe that that was a mistaken policy right from the very, very start, because I think our relations with the United Kingdom are of a different order than they are with any other country in the European Union. And I think that we should have been much more of a bridge between London and Brussels rather than being the cheerleader for Brussels. I also think that, and anybody who lived in Ireland knows that there was a general perception among the political classes that Brexit wouldn't occur, that the referendum had gone against the European Union and against Ireland's interests, but given the track record of the European Union, it was possible to reverse that. And the way to reverse it was to be as hard as possible on the British, to give them as little as possible in terms of concessions. And that policy was, to some extent, supported by people in London. All you've got to do is read this speech there by Ivan Rogers, who said the best thing the European Union could do is feed Britain on bread and water for 21 months. Now, if you've been an ambassador for a country, it seems to me very strange type of reasoning. I think that certainly at the kind of elite level and kind of more affluent levels of society, there's been a pivot towards Europe. But the pivot isn't that deep, because if you look at the situation where 500,000 people, Irish-born people, are living on this island, all Irish citizens, the nearest in the European Union is Spain with 17,000, 1/35 of it. People travel backwards and forwards, but when a crisis hits, where do the Irish head? They head for Australia, Canada, the United States, and that's where culturally we're very, very deep into. Once a lot of the pro-Irish, pro-European feeling in Ireland is old Anglophobia being repackaged. It's the same with the Scots. It's part of our DNA. And once Britain leaves the European Union, and remember, virtually every European policy at the moment is running against what we would perceive as our national interests. Ireland is now a very large donor to the European Union. Our contribution of about $1 billion a year is almost equal per capita as the United Kingdom. It is very, very hard to even get those figures in Ireland. When I was writing my column in the newspaper, I was initially refused the information. I had to go through several stages of the Freedom of Information Act. And the reaction to anybody like myself who sort of queries this and say, maybe we should work with Britain about getting Britain a good deal, there's a very strong reaction, which makes me feel that this European or pro-European or all-embracing European kind of attitude is actually not as deep or as confident as it should be. If you're confident, there's no problem you can argue with people. Sorry, Pauline.
No, that's fine. No, that's what I'm interested in that. And I was going to go to Kevin next and ask, what you think about that. From what you're saying, Ray, it's a kind of it's not going deep, you're saying. It's a sort of surface thing. Yeah. And yet it seems to call on something that is very deep and historical, this old antipathy between Britain and Ireland, and the border in particular is a real sort of flashpoint for that. Kevin, do you see this trajectory as being, something that's just been triggered by Brexit and will die away again when the dust settles and there's a settlement, or is it a sort of movement that's been? Is it a historical trajectory?
Well, I think Ray's right to talk about the importance of history, and particularly a particular reading of Britain's role in Ireland. And I suppose the interesting thing is the way that the leader of the Fine Gael party, which was always not the most Republican of parties in Ireland, can bang the patriotic drum, can wrap himself in the green flag, and even to a certain extent, Fintan O'Toole can use that sort of idea that Britain is besotted with imperialism and nationalism. So I think that's worthy of comment, and I think Ray made a very good point about the importance of that. I suppose the surprising thing is the way that that's then linked with what you might call post-nationalism, and particularly the idea that the European Union has created this sort of modern, liberal, outgoing Ireland. Leo Varadkar sort of sums that up, a mixed race, Taoiseach, gay, modern, young, European, and this is the new Ireland. This is the post-nationalist Ireland, and it seems to be very contradictory that in some ways it sort of wraps itself in forms of nationalism, and then in other ways it says we've gone beyond that, that we're in this new period. But I think the historical tendency is interesting in another way, and that is the historical problem that any Irish state was going to face was its very powerful neighbour, Britain. And throughout the history of an Irish state in the 20th century, its relationship has always been fairly clearly pro-British. A pragmatic recognition that the common travel area, the very close economic ties are all part of that. Even the Irish state's neutrality in the Second World War was very pro-British in that way. So I think that the sort of underlying dynamics historically were for a close relationship. But I think that Ireland's entry into the common market, as it then was, and a number of developments in the 70s have, I suppose, shifted that relationship. And I think the interesting thing for me, and I'm, would certainly welcome a discussion on this, is whether this pivot towards Europe, as Ray puts it, which is very clearly there in the Irish political elite, how viable that actually is. And you might even argue that having, in a sense, decided to throw, to be pragmatic and recognise that Britain was a powerful neighbour, that relationships had to be close, that there has now been a shift, and they're now looking at the sort of new kids on the block. But whether the European Union is a viable entity, and indeed whether it can sort of provide that sort of relationship, I think is open to question. If only from the sort of pragmatic geographical point of Ireland's position, Ireland has done well out of the European Union because particularly many multinational companies see Ireland as a very good springboard into the Union. It's not, in a sense, some sort of great revolution that's occurred. It is, in a sense, just a landing stage. So, as a landing stage, I think it must decide what its future is.
Thanks. I'll just leave it there for the moment because I wanted to pick up on that and actually come down to you two at this side of the table. I'm really interested in, Kevin was saying that Ireland has done very well out of the EU, and that's in some ways perhaps, but I think, well, Troika, bailout, they're still paying, people are still paying a huge amount, a very heavy cost for what happened 8 years ago now. Could you talk a little bit about this, Justin? How does this play out among what you might call the ordinary people? We talked a bit about the political class. How does it play out on the street, on the ground?
It's very, very difficult to detect any kind of genuine Euroscepticism, actually, in Ireland, which is bizarre, as you pointed out, because there are taxes that we are still paying because of the Troika and the EU institutions that were involved in that. The memory of what was done is very fresh. There were referendums on Nice and Lisbon that didn't yield the apparently desired result, and the country was asked to go to the polls again on. There are many, many reasons why there would be a steadfast Euroscepticism in Ireland, and the fact that there isn't really much of one, I do find a puzzler. What Ray was saying, though, as well about what the actual attachment to the EU, I can't speak, well, I can hazard a guess at the political class. The attachment to the EU, though, just among people in general, might itself prove to be fairly flimsy as well. Whenever you see, as Theresa May recently did in New York, she kind of made a gambit saying that a post-Brexit UK would have the lowest corporate tax rate, a lower corporate tax rate than any EU country. Now, one of the things that the political class absolutely prizes in Ireland is its low corporate tax rate. So whenever these kind of issues come up, and you get people like Macron and all that kind of, making, sniffing around this topic as well, whenever this comes up, there are absolute paroxysms of crisis, in Ireland, that we might lose our low corporate tax rate. And, you wait to see, will this generate a discussion on why we are so, the precarity of our reliance on things like foreign direct investment and things like that, you know, as a country and as an economy, and it never seems to take. Recently, when the EU, do you remember the Apple tax issue from a couple of years ago when the EU ordered many multinationals throughout Europe, but in the Irish case, it was Apple to repay. They had not paid.
Tax, hadn't they? Yeah.
Now the Irish government was dead set against this. You know, there was popular Robin Hood type, you know, support for the EU for saying this, but the EU had of course its own interests in raising the issue in the first place. So every now and then, the point is that these flashpoint issues come up, usually something to do with corporate tax rate, where people start, there's a flurry of anxiety, but nothing ever seems to come to it. And if anything, it defaults to a fairly benevolent attitude towards the EU, in spite of everything that they have done to the country.
It's interesting then that these sort of flurries of responses and anger about things, and then it subsides again, does sound like politics everywhere at the moment, in a way, that you get this sudden ebbs and flows of public concern, and then it just falls away. Denis, I wonder if you would, you know, what you feel about the politics in Ireland, because on the one hand, it sounds like it's a sort of acceptance of the way things are. There is no alternative, and Irish people have just kind of internalized this and accept it, and therefore there's no point in getting angry at the EU because there's nothing you can do. But then on the other hand, there is actually quite a lot of politics going on in Ireland. Now, there was the abortion referendum. There's a lot of change in Irish society. It's not a quiet place, is it, Ireland?
Yes, I think probably, you know, what characterises the times on this side of the Irish Sea and in Ireland is that we're in very fluid type circumstances politically. It's characteristic of the fact that the mainstream political parties, both in Ireland and in here, are kind of, you know, skeletons of what they used to be, and that the legitimacy they have is probably quite, you know, tenuous. And there is a sense in which, you know, as Justin says, a vote in 2008 completely opposed to the Lisbon Treaty and to the centralising policies of the European Union translates 10 years later into, I think it's yesterday, the Irish government have asked to join the organisation de la Francophone, which is the equivalent of the Commonwealth, if you like. So they're very much pushing towards as deep as possible an integration into the European type political circumstance. But in a sense that doesn't surprise me, because the antipathy to Britain in Irish life has diminished dramatically. But, you know, there is a sense in which the Irish are kind of more proud of what they are. So in a sense, Brexit represented for many people a resurgence in British nationalism, maybe, you know, as it was characterised wrongly, but, you know, anti-immigrant, a certain element of racism in it and all of that. And the Irish like to present themselves as being the opposite, which, you know, it's funny because, you know, in Britain, the ethnic minority population is about 13.6%. In Ireland, the ethnic minority population is almost 17%. It's bigger. And they make the argument, as they do in the Irish Times, oh, well, we don't have any kind of anti-immigrant party here. You know, we are kind of more progressive. We've left our nationalism behind. And, you know, these British are now kind of, you know, bringing the kind of Brexit thing back into play, bringing, you know, questions of sovereignty and nationalism back into play. We've left that behind. At the economic level, you know, you can take like David McWilliams, who says, you know, Ireland's got to forget about national economic autonomy. We're a cog in a European wheel. We can be a significant cog in it if we play our cards right. And, you know, so the relationship with Britain is one where I think Irish politicians feel a little sense of moral superiority, you know, with regard to, you know, the condition of Irish political life. And it's not, you know, it's a sense in which, it's funny because it coexists with, I mean, I'm from a small village in the Wicklow Mountains, and a guy set up a caravan park there. And it's completely dependent upon English people coming here for their caravan holidays. You know, you're getting, and there's 2 or 3 of them in the general area. And you go to the local pub, and you know, they have sing-songs in the evening and all the rest of it's quite fun. But you see the barman sort of, some of the old kind of nationalist crew come in and they sit in the corner and they start singing a few, when they get boozed up, a few nationalist songs, and you see the barman going, you know, sort of, because he's worried about the English tourists getting offended by the kind of nationalist songs being sung in the corner, or if you're Irish, come into the parlour like a very exclusivist kind of ditty. But so, you know, there is elements of Irish nationalism there, but they're very subdued. If you take the Black 47, the film that's just come out on the famine, I mean, it's an interesting film, it's worth seeing. And it has quite a significant impact in Ireland, not so much amongst the elites who kind of depict it as a somewhat gloomy kind of, you know, genre kind of Western thing and are a bit sniffy about it, but there's been a big turnout across Ireland where it has a kind of populist edge. And it's to do with the fact that I think Irish people feel they're reclaiming their history, not just from British kind of, you know, perfidy, if you like, and untruthfulness about what happened in Ireland, but equally from the Irish establishment, who were equally kind of disposed to kind of portray the national issue as, you know, like Roy Foster, the famous historian, said, myth-making on a grand scale. So I think there is a fluid situation, and, you know, it's not in any sense, you know, a resurgent nationalism or anything like that.
Yes,
but,
yeah. That's interesting because, Ray, I'm going to come back to you because you really talked about when you were talking about Anglophobia, yeah, you were talking about it in what I would say the kind of old school Irish nationalism, where connected to the old questions, of the old border questions. Now, what Denis has talked about is actually a current that I recognise in Britain and in across Europe at the moment, which is a kind of a new sort of progressive ideas of politics which transcend these old quarrels and transcend old-fashioned ideas like sovereignty and self-determination, and they're very powerful, and they seem to be moving us away from the old arrangements. So where does the sort of old intergovernmental arrangement sit in this new borderless or this brave new world?
Yeah, but both trends exist at the same time, and right across Europe you're seeing a resurgence of identity politics in terms of, you know, the true Swedes, true Finns, and that, and you are getting divisions in society between a globalized group and other people. So both of them agree at the one time. Ireland has traditionally been a very hierarchical society. It's not used to attacking its sacred cows, and when it does attack its sacred cows, it slaughters them. And the collapse of the Catholic Church in Ireland, the collapse of institutions all over the place. And that's the problem, is that we don't have enough of a kind of the centre debate all the time. And the EU is one of the last sacred cows. You can't, if you criticise the EU, you know, it used to be like, I don't insult the cloth, because, you know, they're above criticism. So I think that, you know, particularly decision makers, whether they're decision makers in politics or business or that, shouldn't take for granted that globalization is a one-way street. We always thought that, but, you know, globalization is now being challenged much more strongly, and it's been challenged by the people who feel that they weren't part of it. I was at a meeting, I'm not a member of this party, which is just formed for, they want to take Ireland out of the EU. There was standing room, 400 people had paid to come in, and the people there, none of them was from Dublin. That's what I noticed. They're all from small towns around the west of Ireland and the centre of Ireland, and fishermen. And they reminded me of what people were describing often as the Brexit supporters here, or the Trump supporters. And of course, there was unsavoury elements with them, and there was some relative good points. But I think if we head for this kind of homogenised society, and the people who are doing very well at the top sort of preach this to the population, and the person at the bottom can't get a house and can't, you know, they feel society's moving on too quickly, it'll come to a shuddering halt, unfortunately. That, you know, so I think that in Ireland sometimes our you know, elite fool themselves on this, and then we have a huge crash and we go the other direction. My main worry is, as I said, on the European Union, that is, we should have a sensible policy that isn't based on myths on either side, but, you know, it's so much in our interest that Britain gets a good deal on Brexit, so much in our interest, and we can't, you know, essentially commit suicide by saying we're going to veto a deal, because we'd be the biggest person on that. There's an element of bluff in it, that it's time to get back to reality and the basics, and, you know, to live in a dream world where everybody's, you know, has a beautiful house in suburbia. That's not reality. An awful lot of people don't have that, and they're the type of people who are, I think, in the long run, are going to be much more discontented than the Irish political system is allowing for. Okay,
I'm going to actually go out and take some questions, I think, and comments.
Thank you very much. I'm a former customs officer from the turn of the century, and that was the 20th century. And I would just say that both technologically and equally importantly, because of the very strong operational links between Irish authorities and the UK, that the workings of a border system for goods is quite feasible. I mean, that is certainly doable. My question is, really, where do you see, what kind of deal is Ireland going to get from the European Union? Is it going to be the favoured remaining member of the English-speaking community, or is it frankly going to get shafted? I'm not naive about things. I was once warned by an Irish Catholic friend that I might be in danger because I had written a letter during the Northern Ireland conflict to Cardinal O'Fee's office criticising what a priest has said, and my friend said she was concerned that people in Cardinal O'Fee's office would give my name and address to their relatives in the IRA. You might want to reflect on the implications.
Thank you. I'm very interested to hear about this party meeting to talk about taking Ireland out of the EU. And I'd be fascinated to know if Ireland will have learned anything from this country about the funding of different parties, and how Ireland would respond if it found itself in the same situation that this country is in this week, when, despite clear illegality in the Brexit group, the police will not take action because of political sensitivities. Would Ireland handle it any differently?
Both the Leave and the Remain campaigns broke the law. They both overspent, and the campaign that spent the most was, of course, the Remain campaign. So I think this whole red herring about breaking the law is really people don't like the result and wish there was some law that would strike the whole thing out. And also, yeah, anyway, that's all I want to say.
I was wondering if I could get an answer from the panel, because I haven't had anyone really answer this for me satisfactorily, which is that looking at the Brexit debate, everyone's tiptoeing around the issue of a border in Northern Ireland for historical reasons, obviously. But I ask you, if there was a hard border, you know, the spectre of sectarian conflict is being raised on all sides. So I was just wondering if you knew how much of a possibility that is. Have we come further than that?
Yeah, my question is also similar. It's about the role that unionism has to play, and is the border just a proxy for the discussion about what kind of Britain we're going to be?
I saw on the news the other day about a customs system between Estonia and one of the countries on its international border. I think it was Russia, where basically trains are going at 80 miles an hour, and there's a sort of arch that goes over the railway track and x-rays all the freight at 80 miles an hour. And this is Estonia. So when the guy from the customs officer says that there are technical solutions, you know, Estonia's got one. And I'm just interested in...
Thanks, yeah. Thanks. Thank you.
Just to finish my question, which is that since it would seem that there are technical solutions to a soft border, not to get into the technical side of it, but it seems very sort of wrong-headed or hard-headed of the Irish elite to be so set against, given the risks to the Good Friday Agreement. So I was just wondering, you know, what's the political wisdom of that from the elites, actually, both north and south of the border?
Just, I'm sure the others may want to comment as well. Ray Bassett, just very specifically on Border 2.0, the report that was given to the European Parliament. I'm just wondering, because it does have some options in it. I mean, it's not de facto go for this or go for that. It seems to me that on both a political and technical level, the EU is pretending that report doesn't exist. Would you say that it contains the solutions and they're reflected in the report work that you've done? But more broadly, am I right that basically Irish government and the EU are pretending it doesn't exist because it rather inconveniently suggests that Max Vac is more or less the solution, and there we are, but they just have to keep doing bread and water and boiling the frog until, I don't know, February 2019 or something?
I'm 50. I hope to live till 80. Will I see a united island of Ireland?
At an earlier discussion on populism and so on this afternoon, one of the speakers, who was Irish, I think, said that she felt that one problem with the EU and Ireland being a small country was that effectively it was in Ireland's interest to resolve the problem, and Ireland could actually do so if it had a free hand, but it was being weaponized by the EU and Angela Merkel, who effectively took all the decisions, really. And that's where the problem lay. And I wondered whether Ray in particular had any feelings about that it was really the Germans taking the decisions. Not that I want to blame the Germans, but I mean, is there a feeling that the EU is really a command structure and small countries don't have as much freedom as one might hope that they would?
Yes, I think the border's a symbolic question. There is actually a hard border in Ireland at the moment. You know, there are policemen and sometimes soldiers who stop buses in terms of emigration. So the idea that there isn't a border in that sense, I think, isn't true. The border, then, I think, is symbolic for a number of parties. For many nationalists in the north, not just Sinn Féin, but I think the broader nationalist population, the fact that there's a reminder that the border exists, which is then emphasized by unionists, is a reminder that what many nationalists hoped that the border would, in a sense, wither away. Sinn Féin's agreement, or supporting the Good Friday Agreement, was that remember, we're going back to the late 90s, early 2000s, the Celtic Tiger economy, that in a sense there would be a natural economic and social dynamic which would actually make that border superfluous. So a reminder that the border exists in any form is actually a reminder for Sinn Féin in particular, but for many other nationalists, that the project has stalled. And then, of course, for unionists, and particularly for the DUP, particularly for what are often referred to as border unionists, and those are the unionists in the more contested counties like Tyrone and Fermanagh. The border is again a reminder that the United Kingdom still exists. And for them, you know, the symbols of flying flags and so on are really very important. So I think that the technicalities are really neither here nor there, and as you know, many speakers from the floor have alluded to, they can be dealt with relatively easily. This isn't a technical question, it's a political question, and I think, you know, should be looked at as such. In terms of whether Brexit has exacerbated tensions and conflict, and indeed could lead to the re-emergence of armed conflict, well, I mean, that's possible, but I don't really think that dissident Republicans really need a few customs posts, you know, for targets. There are plenty of targets, there are plenty of barracks in Northern Ireland, there are plenty of attempts to attack that. And so I think the idea that suddenly, you know, reintroducing customs posts is going to reignite, you know, a military campaign, I think is wrong. But I do think that there are tensions that exist in Northern Ireland, and that those really have, you know, flow actually from some of the unfinished business of the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement, in many senses, was a, you know, an attempt, I suppose, to leave all the options open. You know, in its language, and Ray would know, you know, this much more than I, did leave all sorts of options open. What for many unionists Brexit will do is to close some of those down, and for many nationalists, again, it will seem to close things down. So I think that Brexit, hard borders, will not, in a sense, cause conflict. The conflict is already there, because the debate over Brexit in Northern Ireland was really a debate between unionists and nationalists, and more particularly within unionism, you know, between liberal unionists who were Remainers and, you know, the more hard line. Those of us who are old enough to remember the campaign in 1975 will remember that many unionists called for a no vote for the Treaty of Rome, which of course has a certain resonance for some types of unionists. So I think what we have is an overlaying of the communalised politics of the north of Ireland, and Brexit is in a sense in the middle of that. And the idea that it's been caused by Brexit, you know, the Good Friday Agreement was in trouble, I think, before, and Arlene Foster and so on has certainly, you know, not caused it, but she's really reinforced it.
Ray, I mean, you were part of the team that, I guess, helped negotiate that, and part of the implementation team for the Good Friday Agreement. So you were there.
Yeah.
Do you think it is, you know, a lot of this is framed, we have to save the Good Friday Agreement. If we don't have the Good Friday Agreement, we'll go back to the bad old days. Was it at the time, surely when for people who lived there, saw the Good Friday Agreement as a kind of transition so that we would be moving into a more normal society? It seems that it wasn't that at all. It was a kind of a holding place. Is that how you saw it?
Absolutely. The Good Friday Agreement recognised differences. It wasn't about reconciliation. It was just saying how we can manage ourselves together. Kevin's absolutely right. The border is a symbolic issue. Because remember, there's no unionist MP for a border area now. And north of the border is not different from south of the border in most places. It's not as if you have a different population with a different view. In South Armagh, they would be the same families as in North down. The border was in the wrong place from the very start. It was put far too far south and far too far west. So you have a huge number of people who are very antagonistic to the border on both sides of it. So it's very, very difficult to police. And right in the troubles, and people don't realise it, there were large swathes of the border were completely abandoned and by the army, by the British Army, who moved back to hilltop forts because it wasn't possible to actually police there except by undercover and SAS type soldiers. If you drove from Dublin to Belfast, the post you would meet at Clog is well into Northern Ireland. It's not on the border. You do get over at Auchnacloy, it was on the border, but it wasn't there. So essentially, nobody wants to go back to that. But the main danger on the border is not that the dissident Republicans do, because there are cameras on the Dublin Belfast roadway at the moment. It watches the number plates, because we had a huge problem about people driving badly in both jurisdictions, and we want to catch them. And it's agreed. And the dissidents have never touched it. There are cameras on the border, and you could do. So I think there is a technical, and I've been right, I think there is technical solutions to it, provided that both sides would relax their regulations a bit. But the European Union has been totally and utterly insensitive on that. They started with the first thing on their mandate was that whatever was agreed in the Ireland of Ireland must maintain the integrity of the union's legal order. So they weren't making anything. So, but it is a huge problem. The issue on the border is not the dissidents, as I said. It's the civil population. If anyone tries to do it, there will be civil disobedience. And that is what is a spiral, almost like the civil rights movement. There will be very large-scale demonstrations against. Where to go, I don't know. The dissidents have been largely neutralised by the security services on both north and south. They do occasionally flare up, but we certainly do not want to create any conditions under which these type of people make a return. They made life misery for thousands and inflicted huge amounts of damage. But we don't want to do that. We don't take the risk. But Kevin and most of the speakers are right. I believe, and I've written very heavily, that if people were of good mind and went to each other, these issues on the border could be solved, and let us get it out of the way. Bertie Ahern, my old boss, said, the last thing Ireland wants to be is the last item on the agenda when we're coming up to a solution. And we'll be steamrolled in the end. Whether we'll be shafted or not, I don't know. It depends, obviously, on the interests of France and Germany, and France seems to be particularly intransigent, and I honestly don't know. I'm no good at remembering stuff. So Justin and...
on the border, it sort of disappeared. People talk about the return of the border and a hard border and the border being visible again. Of course, as Kevin pointed out, it never went away. But it did drop off the political agenda a long time ago, I'd say, in the 26 counties in the south. Would
Absolutely.
That be right?
Yeah, it did. I mean, there was a curious spectacle earlier this year on the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, when the great and the good, Clinton and Bertie Ahern, and all descended for a 20th anniversary celebration, just as the Power Sharing Assembly was entering its second year of abeyance. You know, there was, and in a way, it captures something essential about political elites in the Republic of Ireland's attitude to the North. They only wake up to it or address it when it becomes absolutely necessary. And what happened after the Good Friday Agreement is that it kind of, you know, it was put on ice. All the while, it was not on ice in the North, and it was shaping the body politic in the North in ways that simply weren't being paid attention to in the South. And I think that's that inattention is the keynote to a lot of the issues around the questions of a united Ireland now that are coming up again. These things haven't been discussed in the interim, really, in any serious sense. So there's kind of oh, right, well, so we can talk about this again, right? And what are we going to say? Because we actually haven't really been putting it through the ringer. I agree with both Kevin and Ray about the symbolic importance of the border. That actually can't be underestimated. It absolutely will not, I don't think, lead to sectarian violence again. But by the way, I can't see any of you, so I'm just gesturing vaguely towards the area where I think the question came from. You did say something that was important, though, that discussion about sectarian violence reoccurring came from all sides. And that's what I find bizarre. It is coming from all sides. It's coming from commentators, in the Republic, and it's coming from British commentators alike. And I think it shows an equally poor grasp of the situation.
The interesting thing, though, was, well, Denis, you might say something about this, but 2016 was the centenary of the 1916 Rising, and there was a lot of talk about the old Irish nationalist question during that year. And it was a year that was supposed to be dedicated to talking about it, and yet Justin just sort of said that it took everyone by surprise. So this idea of the invisible border, how does that square with the 2016 commemorations of the Easter Rising, when the whole national conversation was around the formation of the state and its independence and attempt to separate itself then from Britain?
I think
was that symbolic?
Yes,
as well?
But I also think that that discussion of the commemoration of 1916, the kind of founding principle, if you like, of the Republic of Ireland, the 26 counties, was very much how to put it, was arrived in the context of what had been going on for the previous 20 years, which had been the complete revision of Irish history in terms of Irish historians themselves and the Irish establishment were able to, I mentioned before, historians like Roy Foster and many others kind of perpetuated the idea that Irish nationalism had no legitimacy whatsoever. It was myth-making. It was based on kind of grievances that had little or no resonance in the reality of the majority of people's lives in Ireland, but small cliques of kind of, middle-class nationalists had perpetuated this kind of struggle against Britain. And there was little of substance there. That had been what characterized Irish politics on part of the Irish elites themselves in the way that they characterized Irish kind of national history. And that was to do with the fact that there was a war in Ireland and that there was a situation in the north which was very threatening for the elites in the south. And when the commemoration came along, it was kind of in that prehistory. And so they played it down. It was little or no kind of nothing dramatic. And as far as I can see, they spent most of their time trying to say, well, we sent a lot of soldiers to fight in the war, in the First World War, and we should commemorate them equally as the people who died against Britain in Ireland, and attempt to be really even-handed about the whole thing, and not play up Irish nationalism. Because for two reasons. One, the elites, as I've just pointed out, have spent a long time trying to completely suppress the Irish national issue, particularly as the North was an issue. And obviously, European Union is most antagonistic to all manifestations of nationalism. It's extremely antagonistic to it. And so therefore, for those two reasons, 1916, the commemoration was a less than dramatic affair. But the idea about the border returning, I mean, to me, there is an almost element of a kind of racial slur in the idea that there's going to be trouble on the border again. It's the idea that the Irish are prone to violence, and an old Unionist historian said that for the recorded history of Ireland, they've always been prone to violence, and that idea still remains there to some extent. I don't think there will ever be a return, not in the context of Irish nationalism, that we've known in the past, Sinn Féin and so on, a resurgent IRA or anything like that. I mean, historically they were defeated. The reason why the Good Friday Agreement happened, most specifically, was because the IRA were defeated as a military campaign. I remember being in Brighton and Jerry Adams came there and said, I'm coming over here to talk to you guys, but it's the cutting edge of the military campaign of the IRA that will bring us freedom. Well, it didn't. It failed, and failed dramatically. And so, the negotiations could happen because of that. That's why they could happen. That's why Clinton and all the others you've mentioned could come along and be successful. And for a second reason, there was the development within Irish political life of a trajectory in politics that we now know is quite ubiquitous in these islands, indeed in the Western world, the kind of cultural politics of, as Roy Foster said, if we can't find a political solution in the north of Ireland with politics, let's mine the desert of let's water the desert of cultural politics. And so you could see in as early as the 1980s in Ireland, there was a group of people who organised a group called the Field Day Group. Seamus Heaney, the poet, Tom Pauline, the poet, I can't remember, Brian Friel, the playwright, Stephen Ray. All those people got together and said, let's create a fifth province in Ireland. Not the four provinces, Ulster, Munster, Connacht and Leinster, a fifth province of the literary imagination. And propounded this idea that you could start to begin through culture to bring about a kind of sense of, the equality of esteem and equality of tradition in the Irish circumstance. And that, if you read the Good Friday Agreement, you find it suffused with those type of politics. It's completely suffused with it. So that was the kind of oil that watered, or if you like, that lubricated the road to a successful Good Friday Agreement. But the primary one was the defeat of the IRA.
I'm going to stop you there. Thank you for that, and go out and take some more questions.
I think the thing that strikes me is just how messy everything is. Denis, you said earlier everything is fluid. You're completely right. And I know you well, I know Pauline well, but I disagree with a few things. You're right, the IRA were defeated militarily. And when you quote the fifth province, most of the English people in the audience probably have to do what you're talking about. Some of them may. But I just want to come back to the fifth province thing about Field Day and about this whole question. See, here's what I think. I used to think that the Good Friday Agreement was a defeat of Irish nationalism and republicanism, effectively copper, fast and partition. I don't think that anymore. I think we're in really interesting times with Brexit and so on and so forth. And I think there's an old saying about the right wing won the economic war and the left won the culture war. I think if you look in the north of Ireland, you could say that in some respects Unionists won the border question, but nationalists have won the culture war. So you go to Belfast, where I'm from, and what's striking is the buoyancy and the confidence of nationalists. Most of them are watching RT, Irish TV. Their Gaelic games are the most popularly attended sport of any in the north of Ireland. Irish-speaking schools are absolutely mushrooming. Every constituency along the border, as Ray said, is represented by Sinn Féin. 240-mile border represented by Sinn Féin. And the point is, and this is where some people who might know me might be shocked by me saying this, I actually think culture, the whole cultural aspect, the lifestyle aspect, in many ways is equally important as what we call sovereignty in the old-fashioned sense. And what I think has happened in the north of Ireland is that the Good Friday Agreement has effectively mutated into what you might call a score draw. So yes, Pauline had an argument with me earlier on before this session about Britain still makes the laws, and you're right, but I'm actually saying, let's actually look at this question in a slightly new light. I actually think all bets are off, and Kevin Bean is completely right, but the real debate here is about the border, the symbolism of the border and identity and nationalism, so on and so forth. And the point about it is, nationalists in the north of Ireland think that I voted Brexit, I live in London, but where I come from, everybody I know thinks that they think the English treat them as collateral damage. They don't give jack shit about what happens in the north, and that's a real issue. So what they were all talking about when I was there, they all carry Irish passports, everybody I know in the north of Ireland. They say, if they go on holiday or whatever, their Irish passport is no longer the same of quality as a Free State Irish passport, because they'll have to pay the free healthcare and so on and so forth. All I'm really trying to say at the end of the day is the identity, the attachment thing is really important. And you get the demographic question, where they think it's only a matter of time before the majority in the United Ireland. So I just want to say that it's very messy. There's a lot of countervailing tendencies and currents, and I wouldn't completely buy some of the things that I'm hearing on the panel.
Okay.
Others I would.
Good, that's what we're going to hear.
Thank you. One of the least remarked on and, to me, saddest things of the 2017 election was the loss of seats for the SDLP and UUP. Do the panel think that the Northern Irish border question would be much easier if there were 4 great voices in Northern Ireland rather than 2?
Yeah, I want to tackle both this question of moral superiority in Ireland tying its mast to the EU and the politics of the border, because there's sort of an assumption that opting for the EU is morally superior to a position of moving away from the EU. And that question of diversity, and now Ireland's really diverse and so on, but it's overlooking that diversity, seen from the perspective of those migrants, is a relationship of a Northern European neo-colonial relationship to Southern Europe. And it seems to me from the discussion that Ireland hasn't really woken up to the shifts in discussions in the EU. And it should see what the comments under newspaper articles in the Croatian press and that relationship of all those Croats, you know, and other East Europeans in Dublin, etc., you know, exploited workers and so on. And I can tell you that from discussions last night, from one of my husband's younger relations, you know, living the Irish EU dream in a van because there's no proper housing there, he's come over to Britain. And it seems to me that you haven't, that there isn't a waking up of that question. What does Ireland do with all these questions, the repoliticising of the EU itself?
Yeah, as an English person with admittedly a very low level of knowledge about Irish politics, when we talk about the kind of continued grounds for tensions in the north, what's been the kind of generational effect of the Good Friday Agreement, in the sense of people growing up never really knowing the world that went before in any real lived experience? Is there a kind of gap or shift that might influence how, especially young people who I know have started social media campaigns of a type to say, you know, we're from both sides of what was a sectarian conflict, and we don't want Brexit because we don't want these things to return on our streets? Is that a kind of palpable, is that evidence of that kind of action actually something to be taken seriously, or a shift to be tracked in what's going on? Yeah, that'll do for now.
As someone who used to live in Belfast, it really was always shocking to see how these political conversations had a real impact on people's standard of living. The political limbo that they live in leads to a lot of stagnation economically and socially. So right now, I'm very seized with the fact that women in the North are now stuck without reproductive freedoms that are now legal in the South and had been available in the UK. So I'm curious to hear how feasible you think that the state of reproductive freedoms, the limbo that they're living in right now, how feasible is it to continue that? And how feasible is it to continue to ignore that and have both the South and the UK government doing nothing about it?
I just wanted to question the logic of completely disregarding the resurgence of dissident sectarianism. I'm not saying that I disagree with what's been said and hope that it doesn't happen, but having been at home for the past 2 months, it seems to be a real fear that people are talking about, whether justified or not, and it seems to be twofold. One reason being that, you know, those tensions never did fully go away. Joel's right whenever he talks about a generational change, but the problem is a lot of people in my generation still feel a certain way on a certain political divide, but not really grounded in the civil rights movement that sparked the Troubles. So I'm thinking about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, whenever they stopped flying Union Jack for 365 days a year in City Hall, and all hell broke loose in Belfast, and that was one flag. And the other reason is I think we've got a bit of a perfect storm on our hands that, you know, the most important question, one of the most important questions in Northern Ireland's history is being answered. Remember, we don't have an assembly. We can't even get our politicians to sit down in the same room. And that's led a lot of people to feel frustrated and like we're being led into whatever deal the DUP can get us. So it's led to an extent of disenfranchisement. So I'm wondering if it's dangerous to disregard the sentiment in Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Thanks. That's great. I'm going to give you about 2 or 3 minutes each. So to come back on one or two, or whatever you want to, or just to kind of round off what you want to say. There's lots of great questions. Can I start maybe this end and work my way along? So, Justin.
Yeah, there was loads actually there to come back on.
Pick just maybe two.
Okay. I'll try and pick one or two, but be quick about each one.
Yeah.
I wonder, is the Irish attitude to the EU in one sense as, seeking another form of paternalism, having now royally ditched the Catholic Church, that we're on the hunt for another more benevolent form of paternalism, and whether that, to some extent, describes why there is a real reluctance to challenge it, or to challenge Irish politicians' attitude to it. That point about Croatia is brilliant. No, we're nowhere near that. We're nowhere near having that discussion on a national level. We're far too busy congratulating ourselves on you know, okay, rightly, in fairness to you know, in respect of the abortion referendum and so on. But there is generally a self-congratulatory kind of, you know, we dodged the crisis, except we didn't. You know, we're still paying for it, as I said earlier, in a lot of ways. We're not Greece. That attitude is quite Stockholm syndrome attitude is still quite prevalent, and it annoys me a lot. You know, I didn't want to appear to be too dismissive of the idea that, of course, there are still sectarian tensions. But I dispute the idea that this is necessarily going to trigger them. If anything, it is unresolved issues around the Good Friday Agreement, and that, you know, that may be as much of a factor if that does happen. I hope it doesn't. Attitudes to the English. One thing you have to understand, I think, about this question in response to Ireland is whatever. If it seems as though we're sucking up to the EU sometimes, it is because, and I don't agree with this, that it's preferable to do that than to appear to be sucking up to the UK. So, sorry to put it so bluntly, but that attitude is also there in the mix. And it is stunning that the 5th of October 1968 celebrations passed without a whisper or commemoration rather, passed without a whisper in the Republic of Ireland, genuinely. That's all.
That's great. Thanks, Denis. Closing remarks.
There's presidential elections coming up in the south of Ireland next month. I was just reading the candidates' kind of resume. 3 of them are former Dragon Den stars, and one of them indicates that he expects to see United Ireland in his lifetime. The Sinn Féin candidate, Fio Rida, says nothing, basically. She doesn't say she expects to see it. Michael D. Higgins, the current incumbent, will probably win it. But it kind of reflects, to me, it kind of indicates the kind of, you know, the way that Irish southern politics are at the moment. Yeah? A feeling of cultural superiority in the relationship to, you know, the current goings on in England. And as well as that, you know, there's a cynicism about the EU in Ireland because, you know, in Irish society, when people say that, oh, the EU are a bunch of undemocratic, kind of corrupt, whatever, you know, bureaucrats who do, I mean, does anybody know anything about the south of Ireland? You know, have you ever heard of Charlie Haughey? You know, it's like, there's nothing particularly kind of frightening in that prospect for Irish people. So, you know, of linking up with the EU, that'll work all right, thank you. Because Charles Haughey used to fly to Lisbon to get his silk shirts, as it happens. But the relationship in the north is different. I mean, just on the cultural thing, I mean, you can draw an example from your brother, but I mean, my good mate I went to school with took in an immigrant worker from Romania, and you know, kept him in his own house, and he's now married his daughter and has taken over the farm in which he lives. I mean, you could say, is that emblematic of the Ireland that we currently live in? Probably not. You know, but no, neither is yours. You know, your story. But you know, there is a sense in Ireland in which, you know, the prospect of being able to kind of get beyond this whole mess, in the south I'm talking about, get beyond the whole border question, does kind of, you know, is a powerful desire. They don't want to be mired in all this old nationalism. They want to be European. They want to be kind of free of all of that. And the link with Britain kind of tends to drag it back, as Brexit has done. It tends to drag us back into that arena. Now, you know, I have no idea about how widespread that current is, but in the popular kind of, you know, newspapers and so forth, you can sense that kind of desire to get away from all of that. In the north, it's still quite a problem. You know, as Kevin knows well, there's walls across communities in the north. And, you know, Arlene Foster said, in blood am I making this line with regard to, you know, and I don't like the use of the word sectarian because, you know, that's been how it's been characterized by the British and, you know, by many others. Seamus Heaney, famously a wonderful poet, said in one of his poems, you know, there was a tribal situation comparing what happened in north of Ireland to some bog body found in Jutland, where the bog body was tribally killed, said, oh, you know, we have tribalism in Ireland. So they've all contributed to that kind of notion of sectarianism in Ireland, and I don't agree with the idea that there was ever sectarianism. It was a, you know, a different conflict. But you know, just to finish, I mean, every week, what, I don't know how many, 150, maybe 200 buses leave Ireland every week for people coming, ordinary people coming to support football teams all over the UK, you know, sort of Southampton, you know, not the Manchester Uniteds and the kind of Chelseas and all the rest of it. Obscure teams, you know, in the second division.
They're going to Barcelona too.
Yeah.
Hundreds of them going every
Yeah, so I mean, you know, it's like, and you know, everybody watches BBC in Ireland. I mean, RTE is crap. You know, it's rubbish. So, you know, it's like
and it was ever does.
The idea that, you know, there isn't a kind of cultural kind of, you know, yeah, and kind of integration there. But, you know, you get the elements of nationalism bubbling up here and there, but I don't think the conflict's coming back. You know, whatever new phenomenon may emerge, it won't be in that form ever again.
Right. Ray.
Okay, I'm going to quickly, I'm going to concentrate more north of the border. The difficulty of having the SDLP not in Westminster or the UUP, I think if I was up in Belfast during the week and I was talking to politicians, I think the DUP are greatly overrepresented at Westminster. DUP are, and sometimes I have to say to people when they say, is the North so, what they call backward? I said, no, it's not. There's mechanisms there which have stopped it going forward. But, you know, the DUP are a minority in Northern Ireland. They've 28 or 29 seats in the Assembly out of 90. What they do is they use the petition of concern to block stuff like reproductive rights, to block stuff like same-sex marriage. If you introduced a bill into the Assembly tomorrow, it would pass. But they would say that this is a community issue and therefore it needs a majority on both sides of the community. They're abusing the mechanisms of the Assembly. So don't paint the whole of the North on the basis that, you know, that this is even a majority opinion. Certainly up around West Belfast and around the Glen Road, there was an awful lot more dissident flags this year. I don't think that you know, and people are very annoyed at the situation politically. I still don't think that even talking to old Republicans and that there is any appetite to go back. But the point is, don't make it any worse. That's what I'd say. On Kevin has a very, very important point there. When I went to Belfast in 1977 as an exchange student with Queen's, Belfast was a very British city. You go to Belfast today, and there's not much different. You'll hear Irish spoken. The whole city has changed completely. It's obviously changed politically now that there's a kind of a coalition running it, which is not representative of other sides of the community. So things do change. I hate when I hear cultural superiority because it's a terrible thing to have it, and I agree that some people have it. But you know, if anyone's got cultural superiority, time to drop it. You know, we were ones who suffered very heavily from people thinking they were culturally superior to us. So the last thing in the world we should be is like that. And you know, we're very tolerant of immigration at the moment because the economy is roaring ahead at the moment. I have been at meetings where I talk on this, and unfortunately, sometimes when you talk about our exit, you do get people in society turn up who are racist. There is racism in Ireland. Don't believe that it isn't there. It hasn't surfaced as much, but if the economy stopped growing as fast as it does, I just wonder would we be as tolerant. And finally, I just want to say, I love my country. I know we're all giving out about it, but I still love it, and I love to live in it. So I want to say.
Thanks, Rose. Good point. Kevin, last word to you. Kevin.
I think at the centre of this discussion is actually a battle for meaning and legitimacy. I think it was Denis that focused on a lot of the cultural themes, and underpinning much of what people have said is actually that the Irish political class, but also their colleagues north of the border as well, I think are searching for political projects that can give meaning to both themselves and also for their electorates. We're in the middle at the moment of what's in Ireland the decade of centenaries, and it began in 2012, and this was an examination of historical events. But what is interesting is the way that those historical discussions were mobilized and used in various ways by different political parties, throughout the island. And I think central to much of the debate about the future of Ireland and indeed the issue of Brexit and its impact is really Ireland's place in the world, and the nature of Ireland. What is Ireland? Where is it? We're on this panel, we've used the word Ireland at least in two different ways. I tend to think of Ireland as 32 counties, but it is also a separate state that in the 26 counties that have different relationships. So these are really questions that I think are there lurking in the background. And the point about the North and the point about the border is that it's there where they're at their most central. Kevin Rooney talks about sort of nationalist self-confidence and cultural self-confidence. And that, I think, is very significant. But whether it will have a particular political impact, I think is unclear. Whether, for example, that nationalist self-confidence is part of a battle within inside the North. In other words, that it's a response to unionism, and particularly a particular form of unionism in the DUP. So what has underlaid our discussions here has really been about the future of Ireland, and I'm not sure that we obviously can't give a quick solution or a quick prognosis for the future. But I think these questions are raised all the time. So what we need to do in terms of the debates, particularly the political to and froing between London and Dublin and Brussels and so on, is to look for that, because those are unanswered questions. And some people are attempting to answer them in terms of culture. Some people have found a solution in the management of conflicts of identity through the Good Friday Agreement. And other people are finding meaning through the place of Ireland in Europe. And I think that is really where the debate should start.
That's great. Thank you very much. Just one question. Ray, how do you think it's going to go next week? Do you think they're going to get a settlement on the border?
I think they'll get a settlement eventually, but I don't think they'll get it next week. These things go on much longer than they. Yeah.
Well, you heard it here.